You never know what can happen during a simple evening run. Today's story will prove that everything can change in an instant. Stay tuned. Tension rises and an unexpected twist awaits. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. More powerful stories are coming. The evening had settled over the city like a soft blanket, wrapping the streets in golden hues as the last rays of the sun dipped beyond the horizon. The park, usually bustling with people during the day, had become quieter, almost serene. The faint rustle of leaves stirred by the gentle breeze, the distant sound of traffic, and the rhythmic chirping of crickets filled the air. Streetlights began to flicker on one by one, illuminating the winding paths of the park with a soft, warm glow. It was the perfect time for a run. John Cena, known to millions around the world as a wrestling icon and Hollywood star, found comfort in these evening runs. Here, under the darkening sky, away from cameras and curious eyes, he was just another man pushing his body, clearing his mind from the weight of daily pressures. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie and black running shorts, he adjusted his earbuds, took a deep breath, and started his run, his heavy steps echoing softly on the pavement. John liked this park because it gave him space to think, to remember who he was beyond the fame. He ran with steady, controlled breathing, feeling the familiar burn in his legs and the crisp air filling his lungs. After the first mile, his mind drifted, lost in the rhythm of his pace and the comfort of solitude. But then, something pulled him out of his trance. The sound of light, quick footsteps approached from behind. He glanced over his shoulder and spotted a figure gaining on him. A young black woman, lean and focused, her strides strong and effortless. She wore dark leggings and a simple hoodie, her face partially hidden beneath the hood, but there was something about her, an intensity in her movements, a purpose in her run. John paid it no mind at first. Plenty of runners shared the path even at this hour. Still, as another mile passed, he noticed she stayed right with him, neither falling behind nor trying to overtake. It was as if she'd synced her pace perfectly with his. Curiosity sparked in him, but pride kept him silent. He pushed harder, increasing his speed, expecting her to drop back. Yet, she didn't. She matched him, stride for stride, breathing just as steady. They ran like that for nearly 3 kilometers, two shadows moving through the dimly lit park, their footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. The city's skyline glittered in the distance, but neither of them paid it any mind. John felt his body beginning to tire. He'd set a brutal pace, but whoever this woman was, she wasn't breaking. Sweat dripped down his temple as he finally admitted to himself that he needed a break. Slowing down, he spotted an empty bench near one of the lamp posts and made his way over, sitting down heavily. To his surprise, the woman slowed too, stopping beside him and lowering her hood. She sat gracefully at the edge of the bench, her breathing even, only a light sheen of sweat on her forehead. John turned his head, studying her for a moment. Up close, she looked young, early 20s perhaps, but there was a fire in her dark eyes that spoke of experience beyond her years. "You're good," John finally said, breaking the silence. "Kept up with me like it was nothing." She offered him a small, confident smile. "Thanks, I run every day. Helps clear the mind." John chuckled softly. "Same reason I'm out here. Thought I'd shake you off after that last mile." "Not a chance," she replied. "I like a challenge." They both sat there for a moment, catching their breath. John felt a rare sense of respect for this stranger. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amelia," she answered. "And you're John Cena." "Guilty," he nodded. "But tonight, I'm just another runner." Amelia gave him a knowing look. It's hard to forget who you are. You've been in my living room more times than I can count." John laughed. "Yeah, I get that a lot." There was a brief silence before he asked, "So, Amelia, you run like that just for fun, or are you training for something?" Her smile faded slightly as she looked out at the path ahead. "I train because I have to. Grew up in a rough neighborhood. My dad, he was a boxer, not the famous kind, but everyone around knew him. He taught me a lot before he—" She paused, swallowing hard. "Before he was killed in a street fight. I was just a kid." John's chest tightened. He knew that kind of pain, the kind that never really left. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Amelia shrugged. "It is what it is. After that, I made a promise, to myself, to him. I wouldn't be a victim. I started boxing. 6 years now, picked up some jiu-jitsu too. Anything to make sure no one ever puts their hands on me." John nodded slowly, his respect for her growing. "That's impressive, and tough." "I didn't have much of a choice," Amelia replied. "You either learn to fight or you learn to run. I chose both." John smiled. "Sounds like you chose right." Another pause settled between them, comfortable this time. "What about you?" she asked. "Still training?" "Always," he said, "even if it's just habit now." Amelia glanced at the sky, the stars beginning to pierce the dark canvas above them. "I should get going. I live nearby." John hesitated. "You sure? I can walk you back." She shook her head with a grin. "I can handle myself. Besides, you look like you need the break." John chuckled. "You're not wrong." She stood, stretching her arms above her head. "It was nice meeting you, John." "Same," he said, watching her start down the path again. There was something about her. Strength, pride, a story written in every movement. He sat there for another minute, debating whether to follow, but forced himself to stay. She was right. She could handle herself. The breeze picked up slightly as John leaned back on the bench, his eyes following her silhouette as it grew smaller down the path. Still, something gnawed at him, a gut feeling he couldn't shake. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes, trying to push the worry away. Farther down the path, Amelia's figure became harder to see, swallowed slowly by the shadows and the distance. Somewhere, deep in John's chest, unease tightened its grip. He told himself it was just his protective nature. But somewhere, deep down, he knew. Tonight wasn't over yet. Amelia continued her steady pace along the dimly lit path, her breathing calm and her mind focused. The park felt different now that she was alone, the once peaceful atmosphere shifting into something heavier, almost foreboding. The lamps lining the trail flickered occasionally, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move just beyond the corner of her vision. Still, she kept running, her muscles warmed up and her senses sharpened. She wasn't new to this. Late runs were a part of her routine, a necessity born from a life where daylight wasn't always safe. Tonight felt like any other, until she noticed the figures up ahead. A cluster of men stood near the curve of the path, their hulking forms illuminated by the dull orange glow of the streetlights. 5 of them, dressed in leather vests emblazoned with a snarling wolf's head and the words "Iron Wolves" stitched across the back. Their motorcycles, big, loud, and customized with spikes and skull decals, were parked haphazardly nearby. The group smoked and laughed loudly, their voices cutting through the quiet night. Amelia's pace slowed instinctively as she assessed the situation. Her heart rate quickened, but not from the run. She recognized the type. Bikers who thrived on intimidation. Men who didn't care about rules or consequences. Something in their posture, The way they turned their heads towards her all at once set every instinct in her body on high alert. She debated turning around, but it was too late. One of them, a tall, bald man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, a wicked grin spreading across his face as he watched her approach. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice gravelly and loud enough to echo. "What do we have here, boys?" The others chuckled, closing ranks as Amelia kept walking, her fists unconsciously clenching. She glanced around, noticing the emptiness of the park. No one else was nearby. Only the distant sound of traffic and the occasional hoot of an owl filled the night. She forced herself to stay calm, her breathing steady as she prepared for whatever was about to happen. "Hey, sweetheart," another called out, shorter but stockier, with greasy hair spilling from under his bandana. "Where you headed all alone this late, huh? Dangerous out here for a pretty thing like you." Amelia ignored them, focusing on the path ahead. She'd dealt with men like this before, wolves sniffing for weakness. The key was not to show any. Just keep moving, don't engage, but they weren't going to let her pass that easily. "Don't be rude now," the bald one sneered, stepping directly into her path. "We just want to talk." Amelia stopped, her jaw tightening as she stared him down. "Move." "Ooh, feisty," another one laughed, taking a drag from his cigarette and flicking the ash toward her feet. "We like that." The bald man took a step closer, invading her space. "What's your hurry, girl? Stay a while. We don't bite. Much." Without waiting for a response, he reached out, his rough hand closing around her wrist. The grip was tight, possessive, meant to show dominance. Amelia's eyes snapped to his, her muscles tensing as adrenaline surged through her veins. "Let go," she said, her voice low and dangerous. The man's grin widened. "Relax. We're just being friendly." Behind him, the other bikers laughed, their voices ugly and cruel. One of them leaned against his bike, pulling out a switchblade and flipping it open lazily as he watched the scene unfold. Another recorded on his phone, chuckling to himself. Amelia's mind raced. She could try to fight, but 5 against 1 was a dangerous gamble, even for her. Still, she wasn't going to let them manhandle her without a response. Before she could act, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. John Cena had followed at a distance, the uneasy feeling in his gut finally forcing him to his feet. He saw everything. The way the biker's hand gripped Amelia's wrist, the predatory looks in their eyes, the clear intention written all over their faces. John's jaw clenched as he picked up his pace, but before he could intervene, Amelia acted. With a swift movement, she twisted her wrist, breaking the biker's grip, and slammed her fist into his jaw. The sound of the impact echoed like a gunshot. The bald man stumbled back, crashing hard onto the pavement with a grunt. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by stunned silence. Amelia took a step back, breathing hard but steady, her fists raised. "You bitch!" one of the others snarled, pulling a knife from his belt. He lunged forward, murder in his eyes. John moved then, his large frame appearing out of the shadows like a force of nature. "Hey!" his voice thundered, halting the attacker mid-step. The biker turned, startled, just in time for John to grab his wrist mid-swing and twist it brutally. The knife clattered to the ground as the man screamed in pain. Without hesitation, John drove his fist into the man's face, sending him sprawling. The remaining bikers recovered quickly, their surprise turning to rage. "You're dead, old man," one of them roared, charging at John. Another lunged for Amelia, determined to make her pay for humiliating them. Chaos erupted as fists flew and bodies collided. John moved like a machine, his wrestling instincts kicking in. He dodged the first punch and retaliated with a brutal elbow to the temple, sending his attacker collapsing to the ground. Another came at him with a chain, swinging it wildly. John caught the chain mid-air, yanked hard, and delivered a devastating knee to the man's gut, dropping him instantly. Amelia wasn't idle. She ducked under a wild swing and countered with a powerful uppercut that snapped the biker's head back. Another grabbed her from behind, trying to pin her arms. She stomped his foot, elbowed him in the ribs, and threw him over her shoulder with practiced ease. John caught sight of the last standing biker pulling a metal pipe from his bike. "Watch out," he shouted, but Amelia was already turning, her eyes blazing. The biker swung, but she ducked low and launched herself forward, tackling him to the ground. The fight lasted less than a minute, but by the end, the iron wolves were groaning on the ground, bloodied and beaten. Amelia stood, breathing heavily, her knuckles bruised, but her eyes burning with defiance. John straightened, scanning the scene, making sure none of them were getting up. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough from exertion. Amelia nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "I told you I could handle myself." John gave her a small smile. "Yeah, I saw." The bikers moaned, one of them trying to crawl toward his bike. John stepped on his hand, pinning him in place. "I don't think so." Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone must have called the cops. The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, surrounded by the wreckage of the fight. Amelia finally exhaled deeply, glancing at John. "Thanks for stepping in." John shrugged. "Didn't look like you needed me, but I wasn't gonna just stand there." They shared a look of mutual respect, both knowing this wasn't over yet. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, the night far from finished. The sound of sirens grew louder, echoing through the quiet park as flashing blue and red lights approached the scene. John Cena stood tall, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath, his eyes scanning the defeated bikers scattered on the ground. Amelia remained by his side, her fists still clenched, knuckles bruised and raw, but her expression calm and controlled. She glanced at him briefly, then back at the downed men as the first police cruiser skidded to a stop nearby, its headlights illuminating the chaos. Two officers jumped out, hands on their weapons as they quickly assessed the scene, their eyes widening at the sight of the battered gang members and the two figures standing unscathed. One officer, a tall man with a hard face and sharp eyes, stepped forward, his gaze shifting from the bikers to John and Amelia. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded. John raised his hand slowly, his voice calm but firm. "They attacked her. I stepped in." The officer's eyes narrowed, studying John carefully before recognition flickered across his face. "Wait a second. You're John Cena." John gave a slight nod but stayed focused. "Yeah, doesn't change what happened. These guys tried to grab her. We defended ourselves." The second officer, a younger man with a nervous twitch, approached one of the groaning bikers and crouched down. He recognized the patch on the man's leather vest and his face went pale. "Sarge, these guys, they're iron wolves." The lead officer stiffened immediately, his jaw tightening. "You sure?" The younger cop nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, no doubt." The sergeant's gaze hardened as he looked back at John and Amelia. "Do you two have any idea who you just tangled with?" John didn't flinch. "I know enough. They picked the wrong target tonight." The sergeant let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. "Iron wolves are bad news. They're not just your average gang. These guys are connected. Trafficking, extortion, couple of bodies linked to them too. No one touches them because they're untouchable." Amelia scoffed quietly, wiping a streak of blood from her cheek. They're not untouchable anymore. The sergeant glanced at her, a flicker of respect in his eyes before he turned back to his partner. Call for backup. We need more units. Make sure these bastards don't crawl away. The younger cop nodded and hurried off, radioing in the situation. Another set of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. Within minutes, more officers flooded the park, securing the scene and beginning to cuff the battered bikers. The sergeant pulled John and Amelia aside, his tone softening slightly. Listen, I don't know what your plans were tonight, but this changes things. You just made enemies with one of the most dangerous biker gangs on the East Coast. John shrugged, his voice steady. I'm not losing sleep over it. The cop gave a dry laugh. Maybe you won't, but you better watch your back. These guys, they don't forget. They don't forgive. Amelia crossed her arms, her eyes cold. Let them come. I've dealt with worse. The sergeant looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yeah, I believe you. He pulled out a notepad. I need your statements, both of you. They went through the details, explaining everything from the moment Amelia spotted the gang to the fight and the arrival of the police. The sergeant listened carefully, jotting everything down. You did good, he finally said, looking between them. Could have gone a lot worse. John glanced at Amelia, then back at the officer. What happens now? The sergeant sighed. We process them, but with their connections, don't expect them to stay locked up long. Someone's gonna come looking. John nodded slowly, his jaw clenched. We'll be ready. Amelia smirked. They'll regret it if they try. The sergeant shook his head with a chuckle. You too, damn. All right, you're free to go, but stay alert. And if anything, and I mean anything, feels off, you call me. He handed John a card with his name and number. Sergeant Blake. John took it, giving a respectful nod. Appreciate it. Amelia tucked her hands into her pockets, her mind racing but her face unreadable. Is it really over? She asked quietly. Blake sighed. For tonight, yeah, but you stirred the hornet's nest. Just be ready for whatever comes next. Amelia gave a tight nod. Always am. Blake glanced around as his officers finished rounding up the gang, the bikers cursing under their breath but too beaten to fight back. You did this town a favor, you know that? He added. Most people stay out of their way. You stood up. John exhaled slowly, looking at the mess around them. Somebody had to. Blake smiled grimly. Yeah, well, let's hope it doesn't come back to bite you. Amelia took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I don't scare easy. Blake gave her a long look, then nodded. Yeah, I can see that. The night air grew colder as the last of the bikers were loaded into police vans, their muffled threats hanging in the air. John and Amelia stood side by side, watching in silence as the gang was driven off into the night. Finally, Blake turned to them one last time. Go home, get some rest, but like I said, stay alert. John shook his hand firmly. We will. Amelia offered a small, genuine smile. Thanks, Sergeant. Blake tipped his head and walked off, barking orders at his men. As the police cleared out, the park grew quiet again, the earlier violence leaving an uneasy stillness behind. John looked at Amelia, his expression serious. You okay? She nodded. Yeah, just thinking. John sighed. This isn't over, you know? Amelia met his gaze, her eyes steady. I know, but I'm not running. Not now, not ever. John smiled slightly. Good, because I'm not letting you face this alone. For the first time that night, Amelia truly smiled, a flicker of warmth breaking. through the tough exterior. Deal. They stood together in the quiet park, the bond between them forged in the fire of the night's events. Whatever came next, they'd face it head on, together. The night air felt heavier as the police vehicles disappeared down the road, leaving behind the fading echo of sirens and a haunting silence. John and Amelia remained standing side by side in the park, their eyes lingering on the spot where the iron wolves had been just moments earlier, now replaced by nothing more than tire marks and the faint scent of gasoline and sweat. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the weight of what had just happened started to settle heavily in their chests. John exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face before glancing at Amelia, whose expression remained unreadable, her jaw clenched and eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, his voice lower, more personal now that the chaos had passed. Amelia nodded, but didn't speak right away. Instead, she stared into the distance as if expecting someone else to emerge from the shadows. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but carrying a hint of weariness. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's not the first time I've had to deal with guys like that. Probably won't be the last either." John studied her for a moment, admiring the strength in her posture despite everything. "You handled yourself better than most would. That first hit you landed, it was solid." A faint smirk appeared on Amelia's lips. 6 years of boxing. Dad always said the first punch is the most important. Make it count or don't bother. John chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well, you definitely made it count. Knocked that guy out cold." For a brief moment, they both shared a quiet laugh, the tension easing just a little. But the relief was short-lived as the weight of the sergeant's words returned to their minds. The Iron Wolves were no ordinary gang, and both of them knew it. John cleared his throat, leaning back against the bench. "Blake wasn't wrong. We stirred up a hornet's nest tonight. They'll come looking for payback." Amelia didn't flinch. "Let them. I'm done being scared." There was a fierce determination in her voice that made John smile with pride. Still, it wouldn't hurt to be ready. "You said you train every day, right?" She nodded. "Boxing gym downtown. I'm there every morning at 6. Keeps me sharp." John thought for a moment, then nodded. "Mind if I join you tomorrow? Been a while since I trained with someone who could keep up." Amelia grinned. "Only if you can handle the pace." "We'll see who keeps up with who," John teased back. They both fell silent again, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The park that once felt peaceful now carried a different energy, a reminder of how quickly things could change. Amelia sighed and sat down on the bench, glancing at John. "You ever think about how weird life is? I mean, if you hadn't been here tonight, I don't know what would have happened." John shrugged. "Funny thing is, I had this gut feeling. Something told me not to leave you alone. Guess it was right." She smiled slightly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I hate that it has to be like this, that I can't even go for a run without worrying about some gang trying to grab me." "It's not fair," John agreed, "but tonight you showed them you're not an easy target. You're stronger than they'll ever be." For a moment, neither of them spoke, letting the cool night breeze wash over them. Amelia leaned back, closing her eyes. "I always wanted to open a gym," she admitted quietly, "for girls like me. Teach them how to fight, how to survive, so they don't have to be scared." John listened carefully, nodding slowly. "That's a damn good idea, and you should do it." She opened her eyes, looking at him. "Yeah? You think anyone would show up?" "Are you kidding?" John smiled. "You'd have a line out the door. Hell, I'd show up just to see you knock out another guy like that." Amelia laughed genuinely, this time the sound light and warm. "Maybe, after all this, maybe it's time to stop dreaming and start doing." "I'll help," John offered without hesitation. "Whatever you need, equipment, space money, you just say the word." Amelia blinked, surprised by the offer. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," John replied. "You're the real deal, Amelia. The world needs more people like you teaching the next generation how to stand tall." She looked at him then, and for the first time all night, the tough, guarded expression softened. "Thank you, John. Really." They sat together for a while longer, the silence now comfortable as the park slowly returned to its quiet state. The sounds of the city in the distance felt far away like a different world. Finally, Amelia stood stretching her arms above her head. "All right, I should get going. Big day tomorrow." John stood too, brushing off his pants. 6 a.m., right? I'll be there." "You better be," she smirked. "I don't go easy on anyone." "Wouldn't want it any other way," John replied. They exchanged one last glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Something had changed tonight, not just the fight, not just the danger, but the connection forged in that moment of chaos. Amelia nodded once, then turned heading down the path, her figure slowly swallowed by the night. John watched her go, his mind already racing with thoughts of the future, of the gym, of what came next. As he turned and began walking in the opposite direction, he couldn't help but smile. The night had started as just another run, just another attempt to clear his head. But it ended with something more. A purpose. A partnership. Maybe even the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Whatever came next, John knew one thing for sure. He'd be ready. And so would she. The early morning sun crept slowly over the horizon, casting golden light across the city as John Cena arrived at the small boxing gym Amelia had mentioned. The place was tucked between two aging buildings, its exterior worn but sturdy, a reflection of the hard work and sweat that had been poured into it over the years. The faded sign above the door read "Steel Hearts." Gym, simple and unassuming, yet it carried a weight that John immediately respected. He pushed the door open, greeted by the familiar scent of leather sweat and determination. Inside, the gym was alive even at this hour, the sound of fists hitting bags, the rhythmic pounding of jump ropes against the floor, and the low hum of conversation between fighters setting the tone. Amelia stood in the center of the ring, shadow boxing with precise, sharp movements, her focus absolute. She moved with the grace of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, every strike a testament to years of training and survival. John watched for a moment, quietly impressed before she noticed him and grinned. "You showed up," she called out, her voice light but laced with pride. "I don't back down from a challenge," John replied, stepping forward. "Especially not from someone who fights like you." Amelia laughed and hopped down from the ring, grabbing a towel to wipe her face. "Good. You're going to need that attitude. Come on. Let me show you what we're working with." She led him through the gym, pointing out the old punching bags, the speed bags patched up from years of abuse, and the weight benches that had clearly seen better days. "It's not much," she admitted, "but it's mine. For now." John nodded, taking it all in. "It's more than most have. You built this." "Yeah." She smiled, a hint of pride flashing across her face. "Started small, trained a few girls from the neighborhood. Word spread. Now they come here to learn how to fight, how to protect themselves." John's respect for her grew with every word. "You're doing something important here, Amelia. Really important." She shrugged but couldn't hide the flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "I just Don't want them to grow up scared like I did." He placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're making a difference. And I meant what I said last night. If you need help, I'm in." Amelia studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right. But first, you're training with us. No special treatment." John grinned. Wouldn't have it any other way. They spent the next hour sparring side by side, exchanging punches and techniques, pushing each other harder than either expected. Amelia was fast, sharp, relentless, and John found himself sweating more than he had in months. The other girls in the gym gathered around watching in awe as the famous John Cena went toe-to-toe with their coach. Laughter and cheers echoed through the gym, breaking the tension that had weighed so heavily the night before. By the time they finished, both were breathing hard, grinning wide. "You're not bad, Cena," Amelia teased, wiping her brow. "You're not so bad yourself," he shot back, laughing. After the session, they sat together on the edge of the ring, sipping water bottles and catching their breath. "You really thinking about expanding this place?" John asked, glancing around. Amelia nodded. "Yeah, there's so many girls out there who need this, but equipment costs money, space is tight. It's a dream more than anything right now." John leaned back, arms resting on the ropes. "Dreams are worth fighting for. I can help you, Amelia. Sponsors, investors, hell, I'll throw in my own money if I have to." She looked at him, eyes wide with surprise. "Why? Why would you do that for me?" John shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Because what you're doing matters. Because last night you proved you're stronger than half the people I know. And because sometimes the world needs people like you more than it needs another movie star or wrestler." Amelia's gaze softened her walls, lowering just a bit. "Thank you, John. I don't know what to say." "Then don't," he replied simply. "Just promise me you'll keep fighting, keep teaching these girls to fight." She nodded firmly. "I promise." The gym door opened then, and to John's surprise, Sergeant Blake stepped inside, looking around before spotting them. He approached slowly, hands tucked into his pockets. "Morning," he greeted, nodding at both of them. "Didn't expect to find you two here already." "We start early," Amelia replied with a smirk. Blake chuckled. "I see that. Listen, I wanted to stop by because there's been some chatter. The Wolves aren't taking last night well. Word is they're regrouping pissed as hell." John's expression hardened immediately. "Let them come." Blake held up a hand. "Easy. I just wanted you to know we're keeping eyes on them. But watch your backs, both of you." Amelia nodded, her jaw set. "We're ready." Blake gave a grim smile. "I believe it. You two did something most wouldn't dare. Just stay smart." He handed Amelia a card. "That's my personal number. Anything happens, you call me directly." She took it with a nod. "Thanks, Blake." The sergeant left as quickly as he came, leaving the gym in a thoughtful silence. John looked at Amelia, his expression serious. "This isn't over." "I know," she replied, her voice steady, "but I'm not afraid. Not no more." John smiled. "Good, because whatever happens next, we face it together." Amelia grinned. "Deal." They sat in silence for a while longer, the bond between them solid and unspoken. The sun climbed higher, bathing the gym in warm light. There was still work to be done, battles to fight, but for the first time in a long time, both of them felt ready. Sometimes the most important fights weren't the ones in the ring, but the ones you faced out in the world, side by side with someone who understood. And as they sat there, surrounded by the sound of fists on bags and the laughter of girls learning to fight, John knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they'd build something stronger than any gang, tougher than any threat. They'd build a future worth fighting for. That's how the story ends. Sometimes a random encounter changes everything. What would you do if you were in their place? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. More powerful stories are coming soon.